This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. The last couple of Friday Top 10s have looked at lands of colorless and red color identities, and today I'm continuing with that topic by looking at lands with a green color identity. I am well aware that there aren't actually any green lands, with one exception I'll mention later on. Lands are generally colorless. However, non-basic lands that have a green color identity were eligible for this video. That's what I mean by green lands. And that means any land that has a green mana symbol anywhere in the text box, whether because of an activated ability or because it produces green mana. And specifically, this is restricted to lands that only have a green color identity, not lands that have other color identities in addition to green. Under those criteria, 32 cards were eligible for this list, and in this video we'll be looking at the 10 of those that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get to the list, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A Pro Tour, Players Tour, or Mythic Championship Top 8 is worth 2 points, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship Top 8s, and a Grand Prix or Magic Fest Top 8 is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Castle Garenbrigh, which is the newest card on this list by a pretty wide margin. While it's only at number 10, it is impressive that it already has done enough to make the list, given that it was just printed in 2019. When you really think about it, it isn't really that surprising that a card like this has already seen play in 3 formats. That's because, like the rest of the Castle cycle, it's mostly a forest with upside. If you're in a deck that is heavy green, or even better mono green, Garenbrigh is going to come into play untapped most of the time, and if that's the case, you're basically looking at a forest who can give you 2 extra mana every turn in the later part of the game. And sure, that mana is restricted to creatures or activated abilities of creatures, but that's perfectly fine. It's been played in a few different blue-green decks in Standard, including Simic Food, Simic Ramp, and Simic Aggro. In Pioneer, it has been played in mono-green Ramp and Sultai Delirium, and its lone point in Modern comes from a Scapeshift deck. Garenbrigh is going to continue to be played in multiple formats and will likely be moving up this list going forward. At number 9, it is Colony Garden. Like a lot of non-basic lands that produce colored mana, Colony Garden comes into play tapped. While that is obviously a downside, the garden provides you with some extra value to make up for that, a 0/1 plant token. Now, that is definitely not the most exciting thing in the world to do, but you can sort of think of it as a 0 mana 0/1 plant that gives you a land on the following turn, and when you put it like that, that seems pretty solid. It is especially useful in decks trying to stave off aggressive starts from opponents, in particular, decks that can win the game quickly if only they had one more turn, and Colony Garden often gives you that turn. It has gained its points in both Standard and Modern in decks featuring Primeval Titan. Those decks can usually assemble lands that allow them to win the game in a swing or two, but if you've taken too many hits in the early game, your Titan can search up a Colony Garden, or even 2, to help you get to that next turn. It's even better in modern Amulet Titan decks because Amulet of Vigor even lets you get around the downside, since the Garden will come into play untapped. Colony Garden also has 2 points in Legacy, where it's used in Legacy lands, a deck which also runs ways to tutor up lands, including the Garden when necessary. At number 8, it's Lanawere Reborn, another land that comes into play tapped. Lanawere Reborn comes with the upside, though, of the graft mechanic. This means that it comes with a +1/+1 counter, which normally won't be much use on a land, but graft lets you choose to move the counter off of it to another creature anytime you have a creature enter the battlefield. Kind of like Colony Garden, that effect isn't exactly overwhelmingly powerful, but it's nice incidental value to have on a land. That upside alone was enough that Lanawere Reborn was played pretty heavily in Time Spiral Block Constructed in just about any deck running green, including green-white aggro, blue-green aggro, red-green aggro, and blue-green control. For a long time, Lanawere Reborn had gained all of its points in that block format, but recent developments in Modern have led to it having a resurgence. Starting in 2018, a new kind of affinity deck emerged, one that makes use of hardened scales. It just so happens lots of the best artifacts in the game do stuff with +1/+1 counters already, like Arcbound Ravager and Walking Ballista, so adding Scales to the mix is pretty awesome. Scales also makes Lanawere Reborn better because now when it moves the +1/+1 counter to a creature, it turns into 2 +1/+1 counters, which is not bad for a 0 mana investment, especially since it can also be used for mana. Lanawere Reborn's resurgence looks likely to continue, and it'll be interesting to see how far it can move up this list. At number 7, it's Vivid Grove, another land that comes into play tapped. Vivid Grove makes up for it by being capable of adding mana of any color a couple of times, and that's some awesome fixing. As a result, the Grove has been played in decks with heavy color requirements in block, standard, and extended. At number 6, it is Okina, Temple to the Grandfathers. This is another land that, in most ways, just works as a better forest. This is because it comes into play untapped and can do something other than add green mana to your mana pool. In the case of Okina, it can be used to pump a legendary creature. That sounds like it might be a bit of a corner case, but Kamigawa Block was a set with a Legendary Matters theme, and there were lots of strong legendary green creatures you could play. Plus, even if your deck had only a single legendary creature, there was no real cost in playing Okina, since it's a forest and it's fail case. Now, there are a couple of downsides to all of this. For one thing, Okina is legendary. As a result, most decks that have used Okina only run a singleton copy of the land, as getting more than one was a big bummer, especially in the era of the old legendary rule, which would have you just destroy both Okinas if you played a second one. Another downside is that Okina isn't as easily searchable as a forest, but still, the first copy of Okina came with virtually no downside or cost, and that's pretty nice. That's what led it to put up points in block, standard, and extended. I don't think it's far-fetched either to imagine Okina finding more points in Modern in the future either. There just has to be a good green deck that has at least one legendary creature in it, and people will be interested in running it. As of now, though, Okina has only 1 point since 2008, and it doesn't have any since 2015. At number 5, it's Gaia's Cradle. In a vacuum, Gaia's Cradle is probably the most powerful green land ever. It can just produce a ton of fast mana, and that's really silly. The Cradle doesn't even come into play tapped, yet it can be tapped down for multiple mana early on. It has the downside of not adding any mana if you have no creatures, but how often will that be the case in your deck running Gaia's Cradle? Almost never. It was made extra good by the fact that crop rotation was also in both block and standard, making it pretty easy to search up your Cradle. Unsurprisingly, Gaia's Cradle was played in creature-heavy green aggro decks, where it was really easy to abuse. It ended up getting banned out of block as a result of its power. It also picked up 1 point in an extended Elves deck. Legacy has gone on to be the format where the Cradle has been played the most, also primarily in Elf decks. At number 4, it is Tranquil Thicket, a cycling land originally printed in Onslaught. As you've probably already heard me say, adding cycling to lands is just great. This is because it helps you avoid one of the worst feelings in the game, flooding out. If you draw this thicket when you don't need it, you can immediately pay a green mana and see if you can do better with the next card in your library. So on its own, adding cycling for a single green mana to a land is pretty nice, but there have been multiple decks over the years who have found ways to abuse them. For example, in Standard, Tranquil Thicket was played in Astral Slide decks, which played all kinds of cards with cycling to abuse the eponymous enchantment, and in Extended and Legacy, it's been combined with dredge cards, especially Life from the Loam, to great effect. This is because Loam lets you get lands back in your hand, and if you return a cycling land, that means you can just cycle it away again, at which point you can choose to trigger Dredge again, and so forth. At number 3, it is Dryad Arbor, a land that is also a creature. I mentioned in the intro that there is actually one land that is green in a technical sense, and this is it. Dryad Arbor has all the qualities of both lands and creatures, and there is sort of a mixed bag of upsides and downsides that come with that. For example, unlike most lands, it can't tap for mana the turn it comes into play because it has summoning sickness. It can also be affected by damage-based board sweepers. However, also unlike other lands, it can block and attack. It can also be searched by creature tutor spells, unlike most lands. Overall, this combination of things comes together to make Dryad Arbor a pretty powerful land, although there were no good ways to abuse it in either block or standard, so it gained no points in those formats. Like other green lands on this list, it was combined with Life from the Loam, where the fact that it was a creature could give you some serious value. It has gained points alongside Life from the Loam in Extended, Modern, and Legacy. Another card that is commonly played alongside the Arbor is Green Sun's Zenith. You can pay a single green mana with the Zenith to tutor up the Arbor and put it into play, and this results in 3 mana by turn 2. You can also use Zenith to tutor it up in response to an Edict effect, a line of play that is not all that uncommon in some formats. Green Sun's Zenith decks were a bit too good for Modern, partly as a result of Dryad Arbor, and ultimately the Zenith got banned in the format, and it's still banned today. However, Dryad Arbor is still regularly played with Green Sun's Zenith in Legacy. At number 2, it is Pendel Haven. It is somewhat similar to Okina, in that it is a legendary land that can tap for green mana, and comes with a somewhat narrow upside. But just like Okina, you're still looking at what is mostly an upgraded forest, and compared to Okina, Pendel Haven's upside is much more real. Pretty much every green deck has 1/1s, and you don't have to tap mana for the bonus, and +1/+2 is obviously better than +1/+1. It also comes with the same downside as Okina since it's a legendary land. Pendel Haven's status as basically just better than a forest has led to it accumulating lots of points over the years in multiple formats. While Pendel Haven was originally printed way back in Legends, which was in 1994, it did not gain any points as a result of that printing. Instead, it took a reprint in Time Spiral in 2006 for Pendel Haven to start to accumulate points. In most formats, it is played in basically any green deck that has 1/1s in it, so instead of going through an exhaustive list of those decks, I thought I would hit a couple highlights where Pendel Haven was just a little better than it would be in other decks. One example of this was Doron decks in Standard and Extended, which paid you off for creatures having higher toughness than power, and Pendel Haven making a 1/1 into a 2/3 that hits for 3 is no joke. In Modern, Infect decks often seek to do a ton of damage with creatures that start small, and Pendel Haven can really help you do that. Pendel Haven is going to continue to amass points as we go forward, but I'm not sure it will ever catch the number 1 card on this list, which has a sizable lead, and that card is Treetop Village. While the village comes into play tapped, it makes up for it by being a pretty sweet creature land. When you need it to, the village can turn into a 3/3 trampler, and it can do that for only a couple of mana. That is really good, especially when you consider the various advantages of creature lands, like their immunity to any sorcery speed removal, and their ability to ensure decks continue to have a board state in the aftermath of a board sweeper. All of that has made Treetop Village a key card in green decks across Standard, Extended, and Modern, all 3 of which it has between 46 and 57 points in. Treetop Village isn't idle, and I think it will continue to maintain its lead over Pendel Haven going forward. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. It probably isn't too big of a surprise that the green list is way more stacked than the red one was. Green is the color that loves lands the most, after all. It will be interesting to see how green stacks up against other colors, though, in the coming weeks. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you need to catch up on the over 270 other MTG Top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.